introduce myself, I'm Maclean. I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett in the Fine Arts course there. And it's just to welcome you all to these series of ongoing talks of artists showing in the British Art Show. Together with the School of Art, Architecture and Design at Leeds Beckett, we've organised these series of talks. It's going on all the way till, I think, New Year actually, every Tuesday. So, apart from welcoming, I'd especially like to thank today's artist, who is Rachel Mclean. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to see her fantastic, amazing piece that's on the show. Rachel is, for those who don't know a little bit about it, Rachel's originally from Edinburgh. She studied at Edinburgh College of Art and is currently based in Glasgow. My first encounter with Rachel's work was sort of last year in London at Anita Zobladova's space, and she's showing these amazing videos. I was completely lost in this transformative, immersive kind of video work. Rachel is going to be in conversation with Dr Catriona McAra, who is the Curatorial and Exhibitions Manager at Leeds College of Art. So I'm really grateful for being here. So just hand over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much to Leeds Beckett University and Leeds Art Gallery for inviting me to talk, and thanks so much for coming. It's great to see so many people here. So what I thought I'd do is start by talking about the work that I've got on the show, which is a new commission called Feed Me. And that should give you a bit of an introduction to my practice, and then I'm going to talk a bit more about 2 to 3 older works as well, which kind of feed into some of the same ideas. So the work Feed Me was a commission for British Art Show in combination with Film and Video Umbrella in London. It's the longest and probably the most ambitious film I've ever made, so it's an hour long. And as opposed to my older work, it's scripted. A lot of my older work used found audio, which I'll talk a bit more about later. However, the film is kind of quite a surreal narrative. It switches between a number of different genres, so it passes in and out of fairy tale, musical theatre, drama, horror film, TV interview. There's a feeling of you constantly moving between different kind of environments and different kind of genres. All the characters in the film are played by me, so me dressed up in a variety of different costumes, quite heavy makeup, quite heavy kind of prosthetic makeup. Apart from a dancer, there's a dancer in there, but otherwise all me. And the whole film is also shot against green screen, so I'll talk a bit more about this later as well, but shooting it against green screen gives it this kind of synthetic feel, so it's very digital, it's very kind of unreal. So the title Feed Me, and this is a kind of still from the film. The title Feed Me, I guess I was interested in using this idea, or the title as having a kind of dual meaning. So on the one hand, relating to ideas of consumerism, consumption, eating, the idea that consumerism depends upon kind of insatiable appetite, the idea that you can never be full, and the idea that you always want more. The idea that the consumer's dissatisfaction, insecurity, instability, sense of emptiness must constantly be stoked and prodded. Happiness must be kept at bay in order that the promise of it can be offered up again in the guise of things, in the guise of products. Things that numb and appease your dissatisfaction for a moment until you become hungry again. So I kind of got interested in this idea, something of the idea that you have to keep feeding the beast or else he'll consume you whole. Also I got interested in the idea of feed me related to the sense of, or terms of how we take on the responsibility and care for others. So do we feed each other or do we feed off each other? So how do we understand our own entitlement, justify our own appetites, and how do we explain and understand the hunger I guess both literal and metaphorical, that exists in society? So in making the film I got interested in, I think these are just a few kind of references that relate to feeding. So in making the film I got interested in the idea of looking at youth, so both a literal sense of youth in terms of exploring ideas of childhood, but also more generally a desire for the young, the new, the fresh, the emerging, so the new iPhone, the new update, rolling news, the emerging artist. So the idea that you can't keep feeding the beast the same old maidens, soon he's going to want a princess, and then what? Something new, something fresh, something he's never tasted before. So this kind of idea of new and renewal. So the film kind of confuses and plays between the boundaries of the adult and the child in a number of different ways. And because it's me playing all the parts, I'm masquerading as different genders, and also masquerading as different ages. So there's this quite kind of paper-thin sort of gloss value to the characters. They're kind of like avatars, they're kind of almost like 2D cartoons. And I was also interested in playing on that idea of you're supposed to believe they're children, but at some level you know they're not. And this sense of their age and their identity is constantly slipping. As with some of the other characters, there's the feeling that once they're inhabiting a kind of stereotype, and on another hand, it's something more complex and something that's a bit more unstable. So there's these two kind of girls in the work, and all of the child characters have these warped eyes. So warped eyes, kind of like a Disney's Frozen character. So I got kind of interested in this idea of the exaggeration, I guess, caricature, this exaggerated idea of innocence or childishness, and how in a kind of real moving image or a real sort of live action footage it looks slightly grotesque, it looks slightly weird, it doesn't look quite as cute, quite as benign as it does in a cartoon or in a doll or in a kind of more manufactured image. There's also a number of characters which are me dressed up as older people, so in prosthetic makeup, so kind of aging makeup, and again the sense of knowing at once that you're supposed to buy into the idea that they're old, but at the same time it's pretense, it's kind of paper thin. So yeah, and I think that idea of dress up and pretense more generally was something that I'm interested in, and a lot in the film as well, especially towards the end. Well, yeah, there's also this granny character. Especially towards the end, there's this sense of characters becoming other characters, characters taking on each other's voices, and specifically the beast character kind of takes on the role of the granny character in a kind of Little Red Riding Hood style scene. And I've always been quite interested in fairy tales, mythology. It happens a bit in opera, of this idea of the very thinly veiled disguise. So all you need is to dress up in Granny's clothes and suddenly the wolf is mistaken for Granny. So there's something of this very kind of, at once maybe thinly and sometimes more thickly veiled pretense. So the other thing I got kind of interested in is thinking about this idea of childhood and adulthood, and something of the kind of adult desire to regress to childhood, and ways you can trace that through culture. So I guess examples of this are maybe the Google office, so the Google office with a ball pit and all these kind of references to childhood and play, the kind of man's onesie, the adult onesie, this kind of recent obsession with childish, babyish sort of snuggle gear, and also the kind of Starbucks cup, something like a kind of non-spill baby's cup filled with hot milk that people walk around with. So something of the kind of adult world regressing to the child. And I also got quite interested in, so in the film there's all these objects that occupy the kind of adult world, or that the adults use, that are just toy objects, so just pretend objects. So kind of pretend phones and pretend laptops. So there's this sense of the serious world being inhabited by these kind of fairly baroque sort of Disney princess pretend objects. So this is a bit more. I also got interested in this idea of our obsession with children also behaving like adults. So at once adults becoming more childish, and children, our obsession with children behaving in the way that an adult would, or pretending to be adults, and specifically the kind of trope of the X Factor or the Voice, and this idea of children performing precociously well, singing in the way that an adult would, dancing in the way that an adult would, and something of our obsession with that. And I was thinking also about this idea that in the same way that we're obsessed with seeing animals dressed up like humans, pretending to be humans who are kind of obsessed with seeing children acting like adults. So there's something of a kind of obsession with these boundaries and their transgression. I was also interested in the way we fetishise and conserve a kind of privileged, gated off world of childhood innocence, so a kind of mini utopia of the mind, complete with day-glow rainbows, perfectly manicured hillocks, and friendly creatures that talk in kind of babyish gobbledygook, that is helpfully translated by a benign male voiceover, if In the Night Garden is anything to go by. However, I'm also interested in who the kind of fetish for youth and childhood serves and who it protects, as there seems to be little correlation between the desire to see a child sing like an adult on X Factor and a concern for the very real ways in which adults' decisions impact on the lives of children. I grew up in a period in Britain where the fear around youth and the ridicule of the working class and underprivileged youth was rife, exemplified in the use of the word Ned in Scotland, which is like a chav but maybe more specific to a young person. The idea that innocence in relation to the child is something that's both class and racially specific is something I'm interested in, and the idea that in the West the kind of privileged vision of innocence, or the conventional illustration of innocence, is white and middle class, so very often blue eyes and blonde hair. This is just a Google image search for innocence. So I'm also interested as well in thinking about innocence in the larger sense. So how and where do we designate innocent victims? And particularly in relation to poverty, how do we understand innocent, who's innocent, and who's a victim? So I was looking quite a lot at kind of Victorian images of poverty, and particularly the obsession or romanticism of child kind of urchins or street urchins or homeless children, and the obsession with that as a kind of subject for painting. So in these images, the children don't look at the viewer, confront them with their implicit suffering, their innocence. From a philanthropic point of view, people seem to generally be attracted to innocence. Children are still used a lot in advertising campaigns for overseas aid, for example. Then I was thinking about, I guess, depictions of, as I mentioned before, a lot of what I grew up with in terms of what was in the media, so depictions of youth in terms of the chav, and then more recent visions of poverty where we see the poor and particularly working class youth as a source of society's ills. They're branded as crude, lazy, ill-educated. Their plight is not the fault of society but supposedly their own fault. So they're no longer seen as innocents to be romanticised, aestheticised, but instead ridiculed or demonised. So I was kind of interested in something of the way in which we designate innocence. And also the idea of the kind of, I guess in some of this kind of imaginary, something of the collective and the individual, so the idea of the youth gang and the fear of the gang, the idea of children being susceptible to a kind of collective mindset, so not individuals but an uncontrollable immoral mass or swarm, so something of that kind of imaginary. So there's something of this kind of that runs through the video with these children that are something like a kind of gang but suck in these dummies. So I was also interested in the film and thinking about something of the boundary between the imaginary and the real. So a lot in the film there's things, for example, like a finger gun, which kind of works as a real gun, and something of the idea of childhood as the space for pretending, for play acting, for preparing to enter the real or the real world. So I was interested also in this idea of the power of pretend, and how we understand the relationship between what we imagine and what we do. So, for example, there's a scene in the film where you see a character playing a video game where he's shooting these children with a finger gun. I was interested in the relationship of real violence to films and video games which act out pretend violence. So often following a youth shooting or a murder, we're told that the murderer's interest in violent video games and films prepared them or in some way prepped them for what they'd done in reality. Similarly, there's something of this that touches upon the kind of conceptions of the paedophile and the relationship to the law of people watching and downloading child pornography. So something in a larger sense of the power of the image and of pretend and of play acting in relation to reality. So the other thing I was thinking about in the film as well is, I guess, something of our fear of male identity and particularly male sexuality, which is something that runs through the characters of the man, so this kind of blue man, oops, wrong direction, this kind of blue man and also this beast character. So I was interested in this being something that was a contemporary idea and something specific to the contemporary, but also something that could be traced through history, folklore, fairy tale, the idea of the kind of child eater, the bogeyman, the male as this kind of figure of fear. I was also kind of interested in the figure of the beast, thinking about this idea of the half beast, half man, and something of a man that inhabits something of the beast. So particularly the relationship it has there of male sexuality and uncivilized male desire. So the idea of the beastly immoral desire that lives within the male, but which is carefully preened, smoothed out and suppressed by civil society. I also thought about the beast kind of inhabiting a number of identities and seeming to slip between different identities. So at once he's a threat, but on the other hand, in other scenes, he seems more like an outsider, more kind of misunderstood. I looked at quite a lot of fairy tales, so conventional fairy tales or kind of well-known fairy tales like The Beauty and the Beast, but fairy tales more specifically that look at a relationship between a beast and usually a woman or a young woman. And something in a lot of these fairy tales of the idea of the dependence on the beast, the dependence of the beast on the love or affection of an outsider. So an outsider enters the beast's world, they fall in love, and often in these tales there's the idea that the beast dies if the woman leaves and forgets about him. Something of the idea that this outsider depends on the love of the insiders to survive. So I was kind of interested in, there's a few lines in the film that play on that idea of I'll die if you don't love me. So the love of an insider is a kind of food without which the beast dies. So something else I was thinking about too, and there's just another beast, something else I was thinking about too was a kind of inverted childhood and often how children are used in horror films, and I did quite a lot of research into horror films with children and often how the idea of innocence is inverted. So it's very often the exact same kind of blue-eyed, white-skinned, blonde-haired child that's inverted and turned into a kind of demon. And something of our conception of innocence and childhood being, we've set it aside as so other, that on the one hand it's special and on the other hand it's scary. It implies that children have contact with something that we don't understand. So like in the Village of the Damned, they can contact, or they're aliens, or they can contact and have some sort of psychic power with the aliens up in space. Or somehow they have a relationship with the spirit world, or something of that kind of idea. And something else I was thinking about, I guess somehow in relation to this as well, was the fetish for youth and at the same time the kind of sexualization of childhood, and something of our kind of anxiety and also fetish for the boundary or the transgression between the child and the adult, particularly within the women, so the point between girl and woman, and how this is something that's uncomfortable but at the same time something that we obsess over in popular culture and we obsess over as a beauty ideal. So I guess there's obvious kind of examples of this. Well, this is kind of sexy fairy tale, but obvious examples of this in the fashion industry where a lot of models start when they're 14 or 15 and the beauty ideal is youth. It's the idea of looking underage, looking young, looking kind of skinny, girlish. So there's something of, I guess, a clear hypocrisy within that. And I was also interested in looking at, I guess, figures like Miley Cyrus, Britney Spears, and something of the idea that the longevity of the child's starlet is determined by their ability to transition suddenly from a kind of chaste high school beauty to a sexually explicit sort of erotic babe. That this is the only way that they can keep going, is if there's a sudden switch. and they can be marketed in a different way, and somehow we're supposed to be shocked by this, or we still find ourselves shocked by this. And I was interested as well in, I guess, the example of Britney Spears, is that she was able to inhabit a child and the kind of eroticised woman, but when she became pregnant, when she had children, it was almost the moment where the maintenance of these roles fell apart. So women can simultaneously be seen to be a child, a woman, virginal, sexually active, but pregnancy and motherhood seems to ignite this kind of moralising reflex action. So the girls in the film are kind of on the cusp of this boundary between girl and women, and seem to move back and forth from one to the other, and by the fact of being played by me, I'm 28, are physically speaking not children. So I was interested in something of that kind of awkwardness, something of that kind of relationship. Within the film as well, there's also, within the film as well, there's also this symbol, or these two symbols that run through it, of the happy face and the sad face. And I guess the idea for this came from, I spent a lot of time in airports, and every time you buy a coffee or you go through the kind of baggage bit, you get asked, how did I do? And then you press a screen that says happy or says sad. So the idea of being asked to either assess yourself or assess a product, or the kind of prevalence of surveys, was something I thought would be fun to kind of throw in. And also thinking about the idea of consumer research, customer research, market research, and how that changes our conception of identity. Specifically on the line, the idea that we go online and our information is collected in order that companies can predict what we're going to buy in the future. So it's a sense in which identity in that world is no longer about where you're born, what you look like, so much as what you're going to buy. So it's less about the past, and it's more about a future, a prediction of the future. And within the film as well, there's kind of this odd language, something like a kind of text, internet language. There's a ball, a sort of unhappy ball, that is this kind of odd sort of talismanic object, that when you squish it, it says, I'm too happy. And I think something of that kind of phrase was an idea that sums up the feeling I want the work to give you, which is something that's so excessive, something that's so happy, something that pushes things so far to the limit that they tip into their opposite. So when you're too happy, you're no longer happy. When you've eaten too much, it's no longer pleasurable, it's something that's kind of unpleasant. You feel like you're going to be sick. Similarly, the idea, or the term or word that runs through the work is 110%. So also that idea of kind of going beyond the limit of possibility, and the obvious reference to talent show, Britain's Got Talent, the kind of aspiration, our culture of aspiration. Okay, so I won't show you any clips from this, but it's showing next door, so it's better for you to see it as a proper projection. However, I'm going to move on, and maybe I'll just talk about one more work actually, because I'm running out of time a wee bit. So I thought I would talk a bit about one of my more recent works, which was a project I did for CCA in Glasgow last year. So it was at the time just before the referendum in Scotland, and at the time of the Commonwealth Games as well. So the work, Please Sir, is a split screen work. I don't think I've actually got the photograph, never mind. So it's a split screen work, and the way it was installed within CCA was that there was one screen on one side and one screen on the other side, and the way you watch it is kind of like a tennis match, so you sort of jump back and forth. And I was interested in this idea of setting up a binary, something that's very strict binary, and how I could play about with that physically creating this binary cinema space, and also conceptually. So the work references Please Sir, obviously, Please Sir, Can I Have Some More? So Oliver Twist reference, and deals specifically with ideas of class and social hierarchy, but in quite a particular, specifically British setting. The film is loosely based on the narrative of The Prince and the Pauper, so Mark Twain's book, The Prince and the Pauper. which is a story, if you're not familiar, where two boys are born in London at the same time. They both look exactly the same. One is a prince and one is a pauper. And due to a series of fortunes or misfortunes, they swap places and take on each other's lives. So this idea of kind of swapping roles in society, and within the film, the character of the prince and the pauper is this kind of Oliver Twist in sportswear, and the prince is this kind of Tudor Stuart monarch. So I was interested in taking this narrative, which in itself is kind of something that's more universal. It appears as a sort of rags to riches narrative in so many other cultures and in so many other kind of fairy tales, folk tales. There's something that's larger, it's larger than itself. And as a story as well, it's been taken and reproduced in so many different versions by Disney. I think Mary-Kate and Ashley did one too. So there's something that's kind of, it's been absorbed by pop culture to an extent. So I quite like the idea of taking that and bringing it into something that was more specifically contemporary. So this work, as opposed to Feed Me, again, it's all played by me, or all the characters are played by me, but I use entirely found audio. So audio taken from films, from TV, a lot of specifically from productions of Prince and the Pauper, which I mime to in character. So it's more like a kind of collage of existing reference points. In the sense of taking from existing media, I was looking quite specifically at examples of things that relate in some way to class. So I took some stuff from Britain's Got Talent again. I'm kind of obsessed with this TV talent show format. Something from Jeremy Kyle, there's a bit from Downton Abbey. So it's a lot of things that are very familiar, but kind of juxtaposed and set into a different context. For this work, I was looking quite a lot at the history of caricature, and particularly in Britain, this kind of history of satire and the grotesque as a form of satire. So a way to satirise ideas of class and ideas of privilege. And also this, so people like Hogarth, Henry Rowlandson, this idea of making yourself up in something of the kind of grotesque within pretense and within dressing up or performing. So yeah, there's a few examples. I was also thinking as well about, I guess specifically the association of Scotland with social realist cinema, and something of the expectation that Scottish filmmakers make work that's kind of social realist, grim and gritty, and it's about reality, it's not about fantasy or the imaginary. So people like Bill Douglas in his trilogy Mindfolk and Emma Lamont Stewart, Men Should Weep, which are both great work. But I think I was interested in taking something of that as a signifier and playing with it in this world, which is much more about fantasy and it's much more about pretense. So I'll show you a short clip from this. You've kind of got to imagine the two-screen setup, because in this clip it's just got both works on the one screen, or both projections on the one screen. So in this clip, the film itself is 30 minutes, but in this clip you see a clip from Oliver Twist, the musical. It goes into a clip from Britain's Got Talent with a little boy singing a song from Oliver Twist, the musical, and then it goes into Jeremy Kyle. So.
I'm 12. Okay, and what's your act?
Well, I want to sing Consider Yourself from Oliver Twist.
Okay. Is that what you'd like to do to be in the West End?
Yeah.
So who in the West End do you aspire to be like, do you think?
I'll say Dodger.
Right, the character in Oliver Twist.
Alright, your chance in the spotlight here, Callum, off you go.
Consider yourself one of the family.
that performance was that it was very natural and unspoilt. And you have a raw talent, which I think you definitely need to keep.
I think you've got probably the cheekiest grit we've ever had on Britain's Got Talent. Without any doubt. Did you ever stop laughing or not?
Why are you smiling?
Don't know. Just think I
Are you
did.
smiling because you're nervous? See, I don't think it's funny. A few weeks ago, a few days ago, you mugged somebody at knife point. You think that's funny, yeah?
No, I don't think it's funny.
So tell me what happens. Tell me what you do.
Go on, take the money off them.
And scare the life out of them with a knife.
But I'm not going to use a knife.
Who do you approach? What do? Do you target people? Do you think I'm going to go to this sort of place? Well, how do you work it out? Come on.
People like you that look smart.
People like me that look smart. What do you mean look smart?
People that look to see it's got money.
So what do? You lie in wait, you distract me. What do you do? Tell me, how much you love me? Go on.
Well, we've got to grab me and tell you where the money is. The thing is, money will use some on you.
So if I didn't give you my wallet, you'd stab me?
But some of that,
that I made. It's slightly older than Please Sir, so The Lion and the Unicorn I made in 2012. It was a commission, again it's a video work of about 12 minutes long. It was a commission from Edinburgh Printmakers Gallery, and they invited a group of artists to make work in and also about Straquare House in the Scottish borders. This was kind of interesting for me because of the context, not just of the context physically, but also the context within 2012. So it was just shortly after the landslide victory of the SNP, and so we knew in Scotland that there was going to be a referendum coming up. We just didn't know exactly when. Also, it was the time of the Olympics in London, and it was the Queen's Golden Jubilee as well, so Queen's Jubilee as well. So there was a sense of nationalism, both Scottish nationalism, or the rise of Scottish nationalism maybe, and also British nationalism. So there was loads of Union Jacks and things in the shops, and again a kind of almost reinvention or a kind of so a kind of celebration of Britishness too. So I was interested in using it as a way to explore ideas of the relationship, something of the contemporary and also the historic relationship between Scotland and England, and make a work that moved between the contemporary and the historical. So I was also interested in the house itself as a location because it's between, or on the border between Scotland and England, so it's on the Scottish side of the border, and in its history it's moved between Scotland and England. So it's kind of in this borderland area, which I thought was interesting, and also its history touches upon a lot of popular Scottish history. So Mary Queen of Scots stayed there overnight, and there's this kind of romantic story about, I'll flip down a bit, this romantic story about the bare gates at the front of the house, and the story goes that Bonnie Prince Charlie visited the house, and when he was leaving, the Earl, who was staying there at the time, shut the gates behind him and said they wouldn't be reopened until a Scottish king was reinstated to the throne, a Stuart king was reinstated to the throne in Scotland, and this never happened, so the gates stay closed, or the gates are still closed to this day, and you have to drive your car around the side of the house to get in. So it's this kind of romantic narrative that plays into the ideas of the Jacobites and the relationship historically between Scotland and England and the union of Scotland and England. So I was interested in how I could take that and set that within the contemporary. So the film is called The Lion and the Unicorn in relation to the heraldic symbol for the United Kingdom, with the lion symbolising England and the unicorn symbolising Scotland. And I like the idea of these characters being, in one sense, kind of absurd or kind of farcical or kind of childish. So there's a nursery rhyme, The Lion and the Unicorn, and this idea of the unicorn being a fantasy creature, the lion being a non-native animal to England. So there's something of taking these characters and talking about issues that are conventionally discussed in a way that's quite serious, quite dry, quite pragmatic, taking these ideas and giving them this sort of form that turns what is quite a serious argument into something almost kind of like a childish squabble. So in the work there's 3 characters. There's the Queen. The Queen character is a kind of Mary Queen of Scots meets the current monarch. As in the previous work, Please Sir, I use entirely found audio. Within this work, the Queen only speaks with previous versions of the Queen's Christmas message. So starting with the first Queen's Christmas message and then going through to later ones. So she's something of a mixture of a historical and a contemporary figure. The lion is a kind of lion come British redcoat, and he speaks entirely with the voice of both Jeremy Paxman and David Cameron. And the unicorn has got like a big unicorn head, is something of a kind of Jacobean Bonnie Prince Charlie character mixed with a unicorn, and speaks entirely with the voice of Alex Salmond. So I think what I was thinking with this work is, because it was 2012, I guess something of the kind of political context was different to what it became as it led up to the referendum. And my ideas for the work was to make something that wasn't about persuading you to vote yes or no. It was more about thinking of the grey areas between these big binaries, or thinking about ways to discuss something without having to fall one way or the other. And I'm kind of interested in, I guess, the ability of art to talk about politics in a different way. So you don't have to pin your flag to the mast and argue your point. You can actually talk about things that are hypocritical. You can talk in a way that's seeing things from different points of view. So I was interested in taking something of that and also setting up something that was kind of slightly absurdist and a slightly different way of looking at it.
So thank you very much. I was going to take this opportunity to publicly congratulate Rachel on her new piece, Feed Me. I think it's a real triumph as a kind of cautionary allegory to capitalism, and it's had me thinking in all sorts of interesting ways about your broader oeuvre to date. I've been interested in Rachel's work since her degree show in 2009 at Edinburgh College of Art. I actually wanted to start with an anecdote. So you and I were working together on an exhibition in 2012 in rural Aberdeenshire. And we've been working quite intensively on this exhibition called Girls Just Want to Have Fun, after Cyndi Lauper's song. Me writing and you installing the work. And after the whole endeavour, after the preview event, we all ended up back at someone else's house, as you do, sitting around the television, watching the Eurovision Song Contest. And after what had been quite a highbrow opening, I did question what we were doing at that particular moment. And at the time I thought, well, Rachel's worked very, very hard on this show. She deserves some light relief, in whatever form that might take. But now in retrospect, I realised that actually you were still working. and that a currency of popular culture is absolutely integral to your practice. So keeping on top of such things.
I forgot about the Eurovision Song Contest.
And so on that note, I want to talk about the interest in found audio and the iconography that you choose to appropriate. Some of it's so tantalisingly recognisable, almost uncanny, and others you can't quite put your finger on it, but it's probably something that's left itself prone to being parodied or satirised. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you select your material and what are your key resources and what tends to pique your interest?
Yeah, so I look at YouTube quite a lot. I don't think I could make my work without YouTube. And I think it depends what work I'm making, so a lot of the time I start with the idea of there being a kind of theme or something. I've made work that can be something about very banal or just an object that everything else kind of centres around. So I made a work about bananas, and that was thinking, right, what is a banana and where can I take this? And I guess with a work like Please Sir, it was about thinking of class, how do we understand class today, how does this run through popular culture and also through kind of folktale, fairy tale, I guess kind of national identity more broadly. And with Feed Me, I think it was thinking about childhood as a starting point, so youth and childhood, and I started looking at a lot of horror films, and I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, and also kind of pop starlets, TV interviews. I think in some ways my work's not only dependent on YouTube, but there's something about the process of working with YouTube that I'm interested in creatively. So this idea that it's almost like a contrived kind of stream of consciousness. So you take a starting point and you end up somewhere else without even really knowing how you got there. And there's something in my work I quite like about that idea too, that it's like a stream as a narrative. So you're kind of streaming through different reference points in a way that things connect, but not in a conventional kind of narrative sense.
It's interesting that you showed Please Sir tonight, because I went onto YouTube last night and watched the original Britain's Got Talent of that particular scene, and I was amazed at how similar you captured the lip syncing just so carefully, and Amanda Holden and Simon Cowell and Piers Morgan, I believe, were all sitting on that judging panel, and the judging panel format seems to have become quite an interesting area for you. It's appeared in several different pieces now.
I'm slightly obsessed with it, but then I also think that I've hardly been anywhere in the world where you don't turn on the television in a hotel and then it's some kind of form of Britain's Got Talent or X Factor. I was in China recently and almost every channel was some kind of format with a panel and somebody singing or performing. So I think there's something that's so recognisable and it doesn't go away about that format. So I feel like I'm just going to hang on to it until it actually goes away in culture. But also I think the idea of being judged, presenting yourself to be judged, and aspiration, I guess, buying into the sense that we can all be famous, we can all be up there, we all have the potential to be there on the judging panel. It's that kind of myth that you buy into, and I guess it's that myth that these kind of programmes perpetuate. And in a work like Please Sir, there's quite a lot of those kind of situations where somebody is presenting themselves to be judged, so some kind of interview scenario. I think it's something that I can't seem to get away from or let go of.
Someone once said to me that there was the talent show format was used because it meant that they didn't have to pay writers to do scripts anymore, because you were guaranteed a ready-made sub-story with almost every single episode. So I've got a question around self-portraiture and performance as well. Your practice often reminds me of Claude Kuhn and Cindy Sherman. It's often commented upon that you're the only actor/model in your work. Although it's interesting that you've also kind of come up with a stunt double recently for the dancing. I wondered how you've done that. So sometimes it's quite obvious that it's you, but you are becoming increasingly unrecognisable as some of the prosthetics and CGI takes over. And I was wondering on that note, who has been your favourite character to play and why?
I quite liked playing the Beast character in the film Feed Me in the show, because it was, I don't know why, but it just didn't look like me at all. It was quite strange, and quite strange to look in the mirror. I was like, that's really weird. And something about the comedy of the costume was good fun.
Does it take you quite a bit of time to work out the sort of prosthetics and the makeup and get it exactly how you want it to be, or?
Yeah, it's weird how anything you put in your face changes it, and it can be so subtle. Like the tiniest thing that you alter in somebody's face makes them look different. So it's something about it that you don't quite know what this person's going to look like until you're in the makeup, and then you kind of realise, all right, okay, this is kind of the person I am. No matter how much you plan, it doesn't seem, there's always something subtle in it. But yeah, it was fun working with the prosthetics this time, and how much more that transforms you, and how much more it feels like wearing a mask.
So you're an artist, and you work predominantly in video and performance. But I also sometimes wonder if you perhaps wanted to be an actor growing up, because it's so, again, integral to what you do.
Yeah, no, not really. No, I've never done any acting on stage or anything like that. But I guess when I was a kid, my dad had like a video camera, or like a video camera for filming stuff on holidays. So me and my brother and friends used to film a lot of stuff, and there was some part of that was maybe like amateur acting. It was always, I think it was a time to kind of Blair Witch Project, so it was always in that kind of style. A sort of invisible bad guy in the first person point of view.
So you mentioned some of your behind the scenes very briefly, but as you've developed as an artist, your productions appear to have increased dramatically in scale and ambition. There's so much performative energy and visual imagination. And at first it looks like a lot of colour and excess. The journalist Barry Didcock has previously described it as Barbie on acid. But when you look at the range of themes in your work, you start to realise that this is all very carefully crafted, storyboarded, and intertextually narrativized. Feed Me seems epic as a project, and we can see this in the list of credits next door in your text panel. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, give us a bit more insight into your conceptual design and the practical processes for actually making these green screen composites.
Yeah, well, it usually starts, if it's found audio, it's actually the audio that makes the script. But in the case of Feed Me, it was a script, so writing a script, which was one of the first times I'd done that. So that was kind of the first part of the process. And then it's really thinking about what the characters are going to look like, thinking about how you're going to make costumes, so that whole kind of part of the visuals in terms of the actual appearance of the characters is the first aesthetic decision. And then storyboarding, which I guess with this work with Feed Me, I storyboarded at the same time as writing the script, so it was which is kind of fun, because I guess a lot with script writing, you're not going to be the person who's also making the film. So you were able to think about how things would look on screen and then alter the script or alter the narrative accordingly. So I kind of did that at the same time. And then filming on green screen, and then there's the longest part is putting it together in post. So editing all of it together, so the actual footage, just the green screen footage in an edit, and then making the backgrounds, and then colour grading and all that, which gives it the sort of final look. But I guess it's kind of a fun process, because you're never stuck in one part, and you feel like you can think about all these different elements at different times.
So I want to ask another, more forensic question about how you actually landscape and envisage these imaginary worlds. The dystopian backdrop to Feed Me appears to be part sci-fi Blade Runner, part gritty realism of a film like Trainspotting, possibly also reminiscent of the Matrix films. What the philosopher and critical theorist Slavoj Žižek has referred to psychoanalytically as the desert of the real. So I was wondering about how you map your worlds and why this seedy underside is so important to what you show us.
Yeah, I think I got interested, I guess, making police around this idea of there being kind of two distinct aesthetics. And in Feed Me, there's also these two kind of distinct aesthetic worlds. So there's this kind of colourless, quite grey, quite kind of bleak world, and there's this sort of candy, Barbie, Disney princess world. And I want them to feel like there's some, I guess what I was feeling is that in the candy Disney princess world, you expect that world to be synthetic and to be plastic, but in a kind of more gritty, realist world, you expect that world to be real. You don't expect it to feel glossy and kind of shiny. And so I kind of liked the idea of these things butting up against each other. And a lot of the time, I think the backgrounds are fun to make too. There's a lot you can play with, and I get quite obsessed with the details in them too, or things that nobody else would ever notice, but having this kind of level of detail that almost gives you the sense of being in a real world.
So a related theme that I love in your work is that of the monstrous. And I think you use well-known fairy tales like Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast very convincingly in order to articulate that consequence of capitalist desire and the inevitable fallout into austerity. So in your artist statement, you claim that your practice was born that moment when Britney Spears shaved her head and attacked a car with an umbrella. And the idea of gnawing at the airbrushed self-image of white teeth seems to have taken you right up to the current work, Feed Me. Again, the title is so multifaceted. The idea of insatiable hunger and consumerism that you combine so well with this kind of cutesy zombification. Germs, which we didn't have time to show, similarly features this kind of collapse of aesthetic surfaces. So you have this kind of screen or safety valve like skin, enamel and stomach lining treated with creams, bleach and yogurt. And the microscopic is reimagined as a kind of abject menace threatening to wreak havoc. And two of the most successful scenes in Feed Me, for me, are the ogre under the drain who kidnaps the young girl, and the scene when the beast taps her on the shoulder while she's sobbing, and she turns around having turned into some sort of troll or nightmare herself. So your work still seems to be located on this knife edge, and the investigation into the grotesque still seems to be capturing your imagination. As an allegory, does it perhaps teach us to demand more of our existence than the short circuits to satisfaction, or the impossible and absurd attainment of 110%?
I'd hope it would help you to ask more, maybe. I guess something I'm kind of interested in is making work in a way that's not seeing myself as an outsider in this culture. It's almost like you're talking about something that you're kind of in and you can't quite see outside of, you're in and you're kind of complicit in. But there's kind of critique within that. So there's a part of it which does comply with a kind of mainstream entertainment value, but there's something within that that disturbs it too. What do you think? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely given me food for thought. Yes. I think it'll have me thinking for quite a while, as it probably will the rest of the audience. Can I invite questions at this point? Has anyone got something burning they'd like to ask Rachel?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've ever been influenced by Japanese culture or anything like that, because the first thing that I saw, I instantly thought Japanese animation videos.
Yeah, I've never been to Japan, but growing up I think watched quite a lot of Japanese cartoons, and that idea of the kind of childish girl, I guess, like the kind of Lolita girls in Japan, that trend which is taken on here and taken on in the West, is something that I'm interested in, and something of that kind of sexy child thing that we have here but seems to be exaggerated in Japanese culture. I'm interested in, and aesthetically too, at least what we get is kind of an import of Japanese culture, is this kind of very, very baroque, cartoony, colourful, candy world, which, definitely.
There's also, the children's toy as well, which, is a recurrent motif in the practice, and Tamagotchis and Furbies and super lucky kittens. They all seem to play quite a prominent role in what you do. Ever since your 2012 exhibition, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, Your interrogation of popular culture has struck me as very feminist in attitude. And another interesting quirk of early 21st century culture is that the feminist project has been made fashionable once again. Hadley Freeman in The Guardian has devoted quite a bit of her column to championing the feminist cause. The current issue of Elle magazine is described as a feminist issue, providing a very potted timeline which starts with the suffragettes, moves through the Spice Girls and Beyonce, and concludes with Hillary Clinton for president in 2016. And I do think it's important that celebrities are promoting women's rights, but I do worry about some of the potential inconsistencies, mixed messages, hypocrisies that accompany that. And I wondered what you thought about this.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with you. I think on the one hand, there's a lot that I see in terms of social media, like things on Twitter and Facebook that are popularising feminism, in a way that there wasn't kind of that platform when I was growing up, I don't think, or it wasn't something that was within the mainstream culture, within popular media, and the debate around. I guess there's also something interesting too in thinking about these figures like Beyonce, who see themselves or talk about themselves as feminists, and something of the debate that then emerges about other people either agreeing or disagreeing. And I think there's something healthy in that. And I'm always, I guess, careful or wary of saying somebody is or is not a feminist. I think it's a tricky thing to position, how you position it and how you designate that. But yeah, I mean, it depends who we're talking about, maybe. Yeah.
So I'm also very aware that we are two Scottish women speaking in England this evening, and it seems necessary that I at least touch on this point in the context of your work, having shown The Lion and the Unicorn, which, as you said, was made in the run-up to the Scottish referendum. And I think it's really interesting that you've never come out publicly as either yes or no, but are interested in those kind of ambiguities and grey areas in between. And I was just wondering if this was still a productive line of inquiry for you. I mean, David Cameron has obviously given us quite a bit of material to think about recently.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I was at art college, my degree show was work about kind of Scottish identity, but more in like a kind of touristic sense of what it means to be Scottish. So I lived in Edinburgh, and if you've ever been, there's a kind of big tourist culture. The Royal Mile is just shop after shop of places selling Loch Ness monsters and kilt tiles, and just that whole kind of commodification of Scottish culture and the romance around Scottish culture and made into objects. So I guess that's kind of my starting point. And then when we realised that we would have the referendum, it seemed like something that I'd been treating in a way that was semi-politicised, but it became an issue. You could no longer talk about Scottish identity without it being something that was political and current. So at that point I kind of revisited it, so I might do it again, I don't know. I feel like when I made Lion and Unicorn, I felt like that was kind of what I wanted to say. I don't know if I added any more to that, if it would help. And I'm quite interested in not saying one way or the other if I'm yes or no, because I feel as an artist, I don't think it should matter what I vote in terms of how you read the work. I don't want my, obviously your personal political ideas come into what you make, but I think it really flattens something if you say one thing or the other, and it really flattens people's reading of it. And I don't want to be making something that's just taken up as propaganda, or also maybe gets absorbed into somebody else's cause, which I think there is a point, I guess a lot of people have talked about this, that to say that you, for example, are going to vote yes, it very easily get absorbed into the SNP official yes campaign, and it's difficult to make a distinction. And similarly, no, there was a lot of people saying no and then being assumed that they were Tories, or it's this feeling of wanting to talk about things without feeling like you're just dumped into one camp or the other.
Thank you. And finally, building on the wealth of works that you've developed and produced over the last 6 years since your degree show, I was wondering, what does it mean to be included in the British Art Show at this stage in your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's great, it's really exciting, and I would never have expected to get selected, so yeah, it's really exciting, and it's exciting to be alongside such a great selection of artists, such a diverse selection of artists, a lot of very established artists too, so yeah, it's really exciting. Yeah. Yeah.
Does anyone have any final questions for Rachel?
When you talked about you using still images from your films, and obviously there's still images from your films in the catalogue for the show, and I find a very particular quality about the still images.
Yeah.
It's a bit like pressing the pause button amidst the chaos of the movie.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the relationship between the still images which come from your film and the films themselves.
Yeah, I've made quite a few prints before, or images that are intentionally still, and I've usually made them as something separate to a film still. I feel like there's something different about the way, well, I guess obviously there's something different about the way you engage with a still and a moving image, but even in terms of composition, there's things you can do in a still image that are more difficult in a moving image. There's certain kind of conventions of composition that you can work with in a still image that are dissimilar or don't work within the moving image. So I guess the still images I've made have always referenced something more like painting, or something more of the kind of conventions of the way you would pose and the way that you would set figures up within a painting or within a photograph. So I see them kind of as connected, I guess, but slightly different worlds in the way that they're constructed.
Because when you mentioned about the or the split screen, and you're talking about film and painting, it makes me immediately think of somebody like Bill Viola, and I just kind of find it very, very interesting within the critique within your work, this relationship between being inundated with information and also that kind of interesting beauty of the still.
Yeah, I think something, partly the reason I think I started getting into making video is because I studied drawing and painting, and I find it really hard to make a painting without putting too much into it, because there's an element, an aspect of painting where you actually have to be slightly minimal about what you do with it in order to communicate. I think I was just cramming it too full, but there's something about the moving image that allows you to talk about so many different things, have music, have costume, have props that are like sculptures, you can put that all in there. And I think it's nice knowing that, because I guess now that that's the main part of my practice, I feel like if I make a still image, I've got a bit more room to be minimal, because you've said a lot of what you feel like you want to say in the moving image. So,
you've created like an environment for people to come in and enter.
Oh yes.
Just wondering what your thoughts are behind how you come up with the idea of how people view your film.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that one is quite simple in some ways, but I just didn't want it to feel maybe like, in quotes, neutral, or I didn't want it to feel either kind of white cube or black cube. I wanted it to feel a bit more like you're entering a little girl's bedroom, or there was a distinct sort of difference between the space you'd come from and the space you were going into. And I think there's something I quite like about a space that does feel quite comfy and kind of cozy, and something that you can settle into, and something that allows you to be immersed and lose yourself. I think often galleries in a kind of white cube way can make you feel very self-aware. You can see your reflection in glass, and you feel very conscious of your own body. But I guess there's something in that work that I wanted to feel cinematic, like you lose yourself or you get taken into another world. And yeah, there's something kind of fun and kitschy and kind of cheeky about pink and pink and baby blue, so I quite like that feeling too.
And beanbags as well.
Beanbags, yeah.
It feels quite dreamlike. Is that something that you focus on, sort of the way that we're always subconsciously affected by consumerism? Is that something that you sort of focus on now? Is it just a result?
Yeah, that's a nice idea. Yeah, I guess there's a feeling that at least the world in Feed Me is kind of saturated with something that people are not necessarily directly speaking about, or is saturated with these symbols and these images that nobody directly says what they are or what they mean, but there's something in there that's consistent and unavoidable. Yeah, I think there's something in relationship to surrealism and I guess the kind of art that comes out of dreams, and even visually I like things to look, I guess what we associate with a dream in a film is it goes a bit soft focus, or it goes a bit soft around the edges, so everything is quite kind of soft, and I like that feeling of it being kind of romantic, dream-like almost, so yeah.
There's a question at the back.
In order to bring your work to fruition, do you find yourself having to rely on a lot of different aspects, such as people to learn equipment or skill sets and whatnot?
Yeah. So with the work in the show, I think that's the most people I've ever worked with. So I work with like a DOP, and I think we had about 2 or 3 other people on set for lighting and camera. And he usually brings like camera, lights and sorts all that out. And I worked with a guy, Andrew Brewer, in London, who did some of the CGI animations in the film, and Finn Anderson, who did the songs, like the musical theatre kind of numbers, and Julian Corrie, who's a musician in Glasgow, who did the kind of other sound, Foley sound, that sat underneath the visuals, and a few other people beside that too. And it's the first time I've worked with a producer, so it was produced by Ona Falby, which was really great, and it gives you so much more scope. So yeah, there's quite a lot of people involved. Yeah.
I think we have to finish there because it's over time, but thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much.